So I'm going to ask a stupid question.
Go for it.
Start things off. What does the National Park Service do?
Well, most folks know us best for protecting the large landscapes across America. So Yellowstone, Yosemite, the largest national parks, Grand Canyon, those are what most people know us for. But we're also responsible for our historic and cultural heritage. And that's the piece that people are less familiar with. I mean, we're going to be 100 years old in 2016. And some of the stories that come to mind in terms of place and the story and the cultural heritage, Ellis Island, connected to immigration, obviously, the Arch in St. Louis, westward migration of the country, big story for us there. And then things, people don't recognize that we also have the National Historic Landmark, so Stonewall Inn in New York City, connected to LGBT civil rights. And we do this by exploring entire themes. So we just launched an LGBT theme study where we'll look at the places across the country connected to that civil rights struggle.
So just to be clear, because I think when folks hear that someone from the Park Service is going to come out and talk about what they're doing, what you don't expect to hear are historical narratives, civil rights movements for the LGBT community. What you're talking about are urban narratives.
Yes.
And yet you're talking about park infrastructure, highlighting those narratives that are historical, but simultaneously creating a place that is present.
Yes.
Talk to me about that duality, because that's a complicated idea.
Well, most of the sites in the Park Service are incredibly tied to local communities. It's a pride, it's a story that people start to learn about, and then they come together and they really want to protect it. So if you look at Rosie the Riveter, World War II, Homefront, National Historic Site that we have in Richmond, California, right outside of San Francisco.
And for those who don't know, Rosie is the iconic image of the woman with her kind of arm bent with the bandana on from the
So this was World War II. Okay. This is when women first really entered the workforce, in force, white women, that is. Right. And that was the story that the community there was really drawn to. When they started to look at that story, and when the Park Service came in and united the community in Richmond, California, to do the exploration of that story, we found out it was also the first daycare in the country, which is still there. It was the site where each of the ships were built. It also was the story of people of color who really were able to elevate the type of jobs that they were getting there. And if you listen to the one of the oldest rangers we have in the Park Service, this woman named Betty, who got a ton of attention during the shutdown of the federal government, she is a woman of color and talks about how the Rosie the Riveter story is a white woman's story because African American women were in the workforce long before then. So she is our ranger there, and she introduces that story of place and her connection to that town through the location. We own virtually nothing there, but we tie together all the sites, the buildings, the daycare, and tell the story of the whole place. So
what I find fascinating in the case of this one ranger is you're kind of problematizing your singular understanding of this historical moment by having this woman who's got a very different perspective on what it meant for white women to go to work.
Yes.
And she becomes a kind of oral historian. I feel ignorant at the moment, but I'm shocked to find out that, when I think of parks, I think about making sure the trees are taken care of and that the animals don't eat me and that there's not trash and so forth. But you're oral historians. I mean, you're bringing a historical monument that exists in a physical place and you're translating it for today.
Yes. And classic example here in Chicago. So a couple of months, the director of the Park Service, John Jarvis, and I were lucky enough to come here, meet with the community in South Chicago in the Pullman neighborhood that's really pushing to have Chicago's first national park.
Yeah, that's it. We should acknowledge that, right?
Yes,
so right at the moment, there is an active discussion for Chicago to get a national park.
Right.
Which is not a small deal.
Yes, not a small deal at all.
That's a very, very big deal. I mean, and perhaps if I could, before we even get in the details of the proposal and the possibility of it happening, let's talk about the transformative impact of a city getting this kind of opportunity.
Gosh. Yeah, there is huge economic activity tied to a national park. As soon as a site is designated, there are a whole host of people who have a passport, a physical National Park Service passport, and they made it their goal in life to visit every single one of our sites. So not only do they immediately want to be the first people to get the new stamp, so they show up and might not have ever come to that community before, but then also you get a national attention. So what was a local story driven by a local community who felt pride in their history gets elevated to this national stage. And the excitement about that is that you have everyone from across the country who suddenly finds their connection to it and their tie to it. And it helps us as a country to not repeat our mistakes. So you get the economic value plus the historic value.
So talk to me a bit about this kind of multiplier effect, because it's always the amazing things, whether it's like a stadium being built or a piece of infrastructure or a train station, it has its function specific to its need, but then things start to happen. So what's an example of another city, let's say, that is akin to Chicago that has been lucky enough to have this opportunity? What happened?
So the biggest conversation happening right now across the country is the place in New York City that I'm sure you're familiar with, the High Line, which was an old subway line, an elevated subway line that easily could have been torn down. And
lay abandoned for the better part of 30 some odd years after it had lost its use for bringing like meat into buildings, right? It was long since left for dead.
And the city had the forethought, Mayor Bloomberg at the time had the forethought to let some people explore and see what they could come up with. And now, I was just there a couple of weeks ago. Talk about transformative. I mean, that entire community there has completely changed. And when you look at the aerial view of New York City and you now see a green strip along this elevated park that goes through the city, it's changed New York City in a way that I don't think anybody could have predicted.
I mean, it's breathtaking. I mean, to think that on the southern edge of the High Line, the Whitney is about to open. One of the most important museums on the Upper East Side is coming downtown to a neighborhood that was really, I mean, there used to be like
nothing,
some sick madness going on there, frankly, in the 80s. I hope none of you were there. It was some weird shit, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, it was some serious business. And yet at the top end of the High Line, you now have the Hudson Yards, the single largest real estate private development in America right now. And the Javits Center, which has just been renovated.
And it's all connected
all
by a
connected.
park.
And the 7 trains coming across. So the city has embraced it. So, I mean, and I live in the neighborhood. I can't speak enough about the transformative impact, not to mention the architectural landmarks that have popped up around it and the real estate values and so on and so forth.
And the same here, Mayor Emanuel is looking to do this also in the city of Chicago.
So tell me about it. So in the High Line, you have an abandoned rail infrastructure on the edge of the community that ties to a rail yard. What have we got here?
Well, the mayor's looking at his own city project that's similar to the High Line, but in terms of the national park site itself, also tied to trains and to rail. The Pullman location has multiple stories, just like the Rosie the Riveter story, and there is actually a Pullman tie here. The Pullman City was built as an industrial town. George Pullman wanted his workers to have a better experience, to not live in the squalor that many of the industrial folks did at that time. So he built a planned community a la Disney World for an industrial town. Lots of rules, lots of requirements, but you got a nice house, you got a comfortable place to live, and then you were able to work and build these luxurious train cars that transported people across the country. What happened was, when we had an economic decline as a country, he decreased the wages of the people in the town, but not their rents. And that created one of the largest strikes in the country and led to Labor Day, led to sort of the labor movement as we know it.
And what year is this?
We're talking, oh, you're going to put me right on the spot here, and we're talking right around turn of the century, before late 1800s.
Okay, so late 1800s. We have a national economic crisis.
Yep.
He does the incredibly noble thing of keeping their rents high and lowering their wages. Surprise, surprise, things don't go well. And literally, so the foundation of Labor Day, our national holiday, was provoked by that community and that conflict.
And that actual industrial town.
That physical space.
So that space and the building that is there, the clock tower where the actual trains are built, are still there. Many of the houses that are in that National Historic Landmark, it is a landmark right now, are the houses that the workers at that time lived in. Now, fast forward 25 years later, and what happens is many of the folks who worked on the Pullman cars were African American. And they were not allowed to live in the industrial town, but the first African African-American Union started right there in that community. And that led to, so A. Randolph Phillips, who was the organizer of that union, actually was the organizer of the March on Washington as well. So there is a incredible civil rights connection to the location that happened 30 years after the creation of the actual industrial town.
So we're looking at a physical structure, a building, and through this lens, this architectural, historical lens, we're hearing about the foundation of the labor movement in America. We're hearing about the beginning of the civil rights movement in some ways in America. And all of this is living as through this kind of architectural artifact. So then how then, according to this proposal, how do these stories come to life and at the same time create a piece of park infrastructure that makes all of their lives better?
Right. So the unification of the community around telling these different stories is also an incredible story, because you look at the people in that space and you have folks who are very tied to the Pullman Porter story, you have folks who are tied to the industrial story, and they've come together and put aside their differences and say, we say these multiple stories are important to us. Now they want the National Park Service to work with them to fully tell each of those stories, to put up the arrowhead, to welcome all Americans so everyone can actually experience that part of our history.
And so let's talk about that process, because what we've heard a lot about today is the difference between placemaking from a top-down strategy versus a bottom-up community strategy. Mm-hmm. You have a number of different voices and participants and constituencies. How does your institution come in and negotiate what seems like a mess to me?
Well, in this particular case, I think it's just a wonderful gift that keeps on giving the story of Pullman. What we end up doing is coming in, we explore, we do a special resource study to see whether or not it's nationally significant. In this case, the site was proven to be. We do lots of public hearings, we listen to the community. That public meeting was so powerful. The energy in the space when we were there this summer was incredible. And there are two ways. Either Congress can come in, and there are bills in Congress right now, and they can protect the site and make it a national part of the National Park Service, or the president can use his power under the Antiquities Act to designate it as a site himself.
Okay, so Congress comes in and passes a law in the traditional sense in which they do.
Correct.
Or through the Antiquities Act, which I just like saying because I didn't know it existed. Through the Antiquities Act, President Obama can deem this a place of national importance, and it becomes.
That's right.
So just for what's the over-under? What are we looking at? Is this going to happen or what?
Oh, you can't ask me that question. It's completely up to the president, and it's under consideration at this point.
It's under consideration right now.
That's true.
So just so these folks know, whoever lives in the neighborhood can start buying up real estate around this thing. If I had known what the High Line was going to be, man, whoo, I would have nicer shoes on today. So there's a bill in Congress.
There are bills in Congress, and I believe when Mayor Emanuel came to the public meeting, he said, you know, I have the president's phone number and I know what he thinks. So he may have a better sense of where the president is on this. We certainly see the national significance, and the director has said that publicly.
So the Park Service believes strongly in it. I have heard that Mayor Emanuel and President Obama have met.
Yes. Seems like they have a relationship that goes back not too far.
So that's okay. So if I were a betting man, I might feel pretty good about this. Tell me a little bit about, because I think in light of today's conversation, we can't ignore the kind of design aspect of this thing. As part of the proposal, is there already, apart from the stories, what about the physical infrastructure, the physical landscape of this thing? What is it today? What do you want it to be if this thing works out?
So the beginning part would be the restoration of just the clock tower, which did have a fire not too long ago. So we would come in, if it ever became a part of the Park Service, and restore that space and actually probably put a visitor center in the location. We have in our archives and available when the time is right in telling the Pullman story, a Pullman car that we could actually bring in and show people. And then we'll have to work with the city and the community there to see what the full landmark space looks like, because the actual National Historic Landmark that's in place right now over that community is like 300 acres. And if the Park Service were to be involved, we would only have a very small footprint. So we would work with the community to put in place the historic preservation tax credits to help build and protect the stories that exist. There's lots of industrial development in that area. So we then have to work with folks to protect the places that fit into our standards, our historic preservation standards. And
at the same time, work with, I imagine, the private sector to leverage the possibility of how private development can be spurred by this opportunity.
Correct.
Because I can imagine, again, using the High Line as a reference, were it just to have been a park that was frequented by New Yorkers, that's great. That's an amazing thing. But the fact that it became an economic catalyst makes it only better, right?
Yes. I mean, the economic catalyst, you then bring in others who want to protect the architecture, who are able to, with their own insight, look at how to build the environment, building off the story, the existence of the architecture that's there, that's so tied to that story of the Pullman town. And that creates a whole environment, not to mention the pride. I mean, the actual connection to the story and history and the pride that it's important enough for the entire nation to know about. And we want to invite everybody to experience it.
So if all things go well, and again, I'm not a betting man, but were they to go well, you have an opportunity to restore an area that has been left essentially forgotten.
Correct.
You have an opportunity to bring forth stories that are of national historical importance for both racial development, for labor force development, and stories that may not necessarily be known at a local civic level, but certainly not at the national level. And there's also this massive economic opportunity that could be a result, and you have precedents to demonstrate that there is this multiplier effect that could happen. So we talk about a park, but it's really a kind of an urban catalyst that can transform a big part of everyone's life here in the audience.
And a park is so much more than just what people define it as in terms of a Yellowstone or a Grand Canyon. If you look at the vast work of what the National Park Service does, a park can be that moment in your urban environment where you're at the High Line and you escape and you think and you dream about the possibility of what could happen. A park can be, I mean, the whole video that we just saw of music connected to the National Mall was incredible. I mean, the definition of park will change and will advance around the centennial as we invite all Americans to experience all that we do.
It's more than trees.
More than trees.
So I did hear, though, depending on the scope and scale of the applause, you have a higher chance of getting this park. So ladies and gentlemen, Christy Goldfuss. Thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you.